Hey there, it's John from Living the Music. Today we're going to attempt to answer or at least explore a huge question in Paul McCartney history, which is why did his partnership with Denny Laine from Wings break up in the early 1980s? Or to be more specific, why did Denny Laine himself choose to leave the partnership, choose to leave Wings, which he in fact did in late April of 1981. So we can look at it from the angle of timeline, and this led to this and that and so forth. And we can also look at it in terms of personalities, resentments, and let's see what we can come up with given what we know. I don't think either of them necessarily said exactly why it happened. That is to say, I don't think Paul is on the record, nor Denny. Now, Paul has a book on Wings, which is just released here in 2025 in November. So we'll look at that in more detail, but I still have my doubts whether he's going to come totally clean on what went down there. We also have these great resources from Allan, Kozinn, and Adrian Sinclair called the McCartney Legacy. I have these two volumes here which have been produced so far, Volume 1, Volume 2, and this covers essentially McCartney in the 70s and the Wings period. Although this second volume ends right after the drug bust in Japan in 1980, so they don't actually go into the breakup of Wings, which would come about a year later. Apparently, they'll do that in Volume 3, which I am definitely eagerly awaiting. So we'll see what those guys come up with. But I think we can piece some things together here today that make some sense. And, you know, for fans of Wings and Denny and Paul or either or, hopefully this will be fun and maybe educational. And feel free to jump in the comments and provide your perspective. Certainly, I don't know everything. All right, so where to start? Well, of course, we know they began their partnership early on in Wings. Denny was the second person Paul asked to join his band after his wife, Linda. He had toyed with, or not just toyed with, actually, he invited this guy from the Ram sessions. I'm blanking on his name at the moment. Maybe it'll come to me. But there was a guitarist. There were two guitarists on the Ram session, one of which did sort of the latter half of the album with Paul. And Paul apparently invited him to join his new band. But the guy begged off. He didn't, I suppose, at the time give a reason, but he later told Denny Seiwell, the drummer of Wings, that it was really because he had a young family and he wanted a more kind of stable job situation, which he had in New York, where he was a session musician and he could kind of work, I don't know if it was 9 to 5, but he could have a more or less settled routine, and that's what he decided to go for. And Paul was very disappointed by that. Hugh McCracken, that's his name. I thought it might come to me. The other guy, God, I just blank on it. But as I say, there was another guitarist in Ram, but he was never invited. They actually got into a little conflict on scheduling during Ram. But Hugh McCracken and Paul, they had a good working relationship on Ram, and you can see the results there. It's a tremendous album, and the guitar playing is excellent throughout. So I'm sure that was disappointing. But the next person Paul thought of, as far as I know, is Denny Laine. So Denny Laine was in the Moody Blues, at least on their first album, and he was the singer of their biggest hit, I think, at the time, or, you know, the time he was in the band, and that was called Go Now. And Paul had known Denny even before he was in Moody Blues in a band called the Diplomats back in the early 60s, and they did some shows together with the Beatles, so he was friendly with the Beatles, that is, Denny was, going way back, and he and Paul would meet up at the clubs and hang out. So they had a connection of friendship, but also Paul always admired his voice, and I think he knew he could play guitar and was a multi-instrumentalist of sorts. He could play bass, guitar at least, and keyboards. So he rung him up, and Denny said, yeah, I mean, he really didn't have much going at the time. And he says, sure, I'll team up with Paul McCartney. That sounds like a great next step for my life. So they jump in, they do the Wildlife album, which comes out in 1971. They have singles in there, Give My, the Irish song, Give Ireland Back to the Irish, excuse me. They got High, High, High. They got Junior's Farm in there. They're always releasing singles. They did Red Rose Speedway, following up from Wildlife, and eventually the breakout album, Band on the Run, and then into Venus and Mars in 1975, followed by Wings at the Speed of Sound in 76. They go on a big tour of America, very big success, Riding High. They do Wings Over America album. That's another big success. Then they go into London Town, which comes out in 78. They got Mull of Kintyre, which is the biggest selling single of all time in Britain, when it came out anyway. And then that leads into the Back to the Egg sessions in 1979. Now, let's pick things up there in more specific, because here's where some fractures start to happen. Now, let's start with personalities here, because if not just personality, let's say personal habits that were also going on. So for one thing, Denny, I think, was somewhat of a restless musician. He had gone through a number of different incarnations early on before he joined Wings. I don't even know if I can recall all the incarnations he was in, but he was in a band called Balls, believe it or not. He was in Electric String Orchestra, something like that, Electric String Band. He was in Ginger Baker's Air Force for a little bit. So, and he had other partnerships which didn't come to recording fruition, but and I already, he already said he left Moody Blues quite early in their career. So I think he was restless in a sense, which is not a bad characteristic, but I think it's actually surprising in a way that he maintained his partnership with Paul for 10 years. But I think over the course of that 10 years, there were inevitable resentments which may have built up, which can happen in any relationship. I think on the songwriting front, it was complicated, because on the one hand, Denny would want to contribute and want to be more prominent in the songwriting, both for creative reasons and publishing reasons. And then on the other hand, there were times, maybe long stretches of times, where he wasn't writing that much material. And, he kind of vacillated between maybe offering up a bunch of different things and maybe having some of it rejected, and then at other times not really having much to offer up. And, you could see how either way you could have resentments of Paul McCartney, who's so prolific, and also as the ex-Beatle is so famous and such a musical force, he's bound to basically run the show. And I think for the most part, Denny submerged his ego and went along with Paul's plans and supported him as best he could. But as I say, I think resentments are bound to build up over time. So the songwriting is part of that, and then also the financial front, where I don't think he ever really got a contract of, you're an equal member of this group. I think he was pretty much on a stipend of sorts, a salary, if you will, probably quite generous certainly as the later stages of Wings went on. And he did get some songwriting publishing, and there's I think some royalties you get for just being on the album as a musician. So I'm sure he was making a pretty good living. I seem to recall near the end of Wings he was driving a Lamborghini. So I think he was riding pretty high there by 78, 79 era. But still, he's got to have, or he could have had at least, it would be understandable if he had some financial resentments about the way he was treated as, certainly not an equal, and there's some disappointments there. Now, some of it his own creation by not coming up with more songs and maybe better songs, but some of it just because Paul was coming up with so many and Paul wanted to run the show, and maybe he wasn't that interested in Denny's songs, kind of like at various points in the Beatles, he wasn't that interested in George's songs, or at least so it seemed. So you got all that going on. I think also it's documented that Denny had some alcohol issues. Certainly this progressed later in his life. I think there were other substance abuses going on in this late 70s period. So that's playing into all of this. Paul, of course, is a notorious pothead, if I may say, or at least he certainly was at that time. And, it all seems, kind of fun and benign, but it doesn't give you necessarily the best space to make decisions all the time. So that's all happening behind the scenes. Now let's pick up the timeline around about the Back to the Egg period. Going into Back to the Egg, Paul and Denny appear to be in pretty strong partnership together, because it was Denny's friend that he kind of, neighbor, I suppose, that became a friend, that was Steve Holley, the drummer, whom they drafted into Wings. And then Lawrence Juber was a guy that Denny met when he was guesting on a television show in Britain. Lawrence was the house guitarist for that show. Denny, I suppose, liked him, liked his playing, liked his look, recommended him to Paul, and he got into the band. So you could see Denny's having some influence there. They go into Back to the Egg, and this takes a year to record. They get Chris Thomas in to produce. He's fresh off of producing the Sex Pistols album, and they have high hopes for this album. Now, they didn't put Goodnight Tonight on it. They didn't put Daytime Nighttime Suffering on it. It ends up being a rather eclectic album, some of it with surprisingly hard rock on it, sort of punkish at times, even metal at times with the old Siam Sir riffs. And then you got some very soft pieces. You even got some sort of like standard, 40s type music with My Baby's Request. So it's all over the place stylistically. And there's not really a drop-dead pop hit on it, which turns out to show up in the charts, where they're hanging around in the 20s and the 40s in their chart position with their singles. The album gets to number 10 in America, but it kind of sinks pretty quickly. Denny has one song on there, Again and Again and Again, which Paul helped him put together. It has two different songs that they merged together at Paul's suggestion. He seemed to be enthusiastic about working with Denny on that song. So, that's nice, but it's still one out of a dozen or so. And for the rest of it, Denny's kind of in the background, and once again, Paul's running the show. But all that's leading up to a big, well, not big, but at least it's a tour of England where they purposefully did theater shows rather than arenas or stadiums. Paul, having come off of Wings Over America, he wanted to tighten things up and have a more of a connection with the audience, I suppose, and kind of take pare down the production of video and lasers and all that. So they do several dates in the UK only. And if you look at some of the videos of that, it's very pared down, just a curtain and lights. It's really very basic in its presentation. Now, they do No Words in there, I believe, from Band on the Run, which is a Denny Laine co-write. He does Go Now again. I think he does Again and Again and Again from the Back to the Egg. So he's involved, but also in that tour, Paul brings in more Beatles songs. He brings in Let It Be. They open the show with Got to Get You Into My Life. So he's already starting to think in more nostalgic terms. And he even brings in stuff from the McCartney album, where, of course, that was a solo album. And, Wonderful Christmas Time is on that tour, which is also a McCartney solo song. So I don't think that went unnoticed, but still, Denny's happy to be on tour. It's pretty good payday for him. And then they're looking forward to the Japan tour, which is going to be a much bigger payday. And we all know what happens there. They rehearse, they fly over there, everything's set, the program's set, the merchandise is set. They're going to just kill it over in Japan, and Paul gets busted with many ounces of pot at the airport. He's sent to prison. He serves 9 or 10 days in prison. Denny and the other guys from Wings, they're devastated. They pretty much just go home. And, so again, talk about resentments. I think Denny had quite a bit of resentment about that. Just, like, what are you thinking, Paul? Like, why? And Paul has no explanation for it. He says sometimes you're just stupid, and it was really good pot. He didn't want to waste it, and they did want to have something to indulge when they were over in Japan. He, essentially he just wanted to do it, and he thought he could get away with it. He was used to being a Beatle, and he didn't think there would be a problem with it. But there was. So what happens next? Well, apparently Paul does some soul searching in jail, and one of the things he starts thinking about is working with George Martin again. He'd been producing all the Wings albums up to Back to the Egg, where he brought in Chris Thomas as a co-producer. But he started to think, what, I want to get back with George Martin and do a real professional job with my next album. So again, you see that Beatle nostalgia coming into play here. Now, sometime in 1980, he releases McCartney 2. You can imagine how Denny receives that. Now, he had done these recordings pretty much soon after they had finished the recordings of Back to the Egg. And as he says, he wasn't really initially recording an album. He was just having fun with synths and drums and just seeing what he could come up with. But eventually, he did like most of what he heard, and he wanted to put an album out. So this, in fact, comes out in 1980. Now, it does have the Wings version of Coming Up as the B-side of the single. That goes big in America, becomes, I think, a number one hit. So Wings is still in play there indirectly, but Denny can see what, this is what's happening here. Paul's putting out a solo album. I suppose it doesn't necessarily have to ring alarm bells, but it's got to raise some questions about what's next. Now, around this time, I don't know if it was because he saw what Paul was doing, but Denny's also working on a solo album, and eventually in late 1980, in December, he comes out with this album, Japanese Tears. Now this apparently is with Paul's blessing. There's a couple of tunes on here that are from Wings sessions that Paul I think, gave him the tracks, the master tapes, and allowed Denny to release these under his own name. And so I think all is pretty much well, and I'm sure Denny had high hopes for this album. Now, he does have the song, which is the title track, Japanese Tears, on here, which Paul may not have taken so graciously, I don't know, but in that song, Denny relates being in Japan and meeting fans, particularly like a young girl who was really sad that she wouldn't be able to see Paul. You know, she was really looking forward to the show, and probably more than one person, but anyway, that one fan in particular struck him, and so he writes about the Japanese Tears, and it's not really like an angry song, but still to come out with this, you know, your single from this album, to call the album this, you could say it's somewhat of a statement about Paul, if nothing else, if not to Paul. So that's noted. However, Paul eventually does get it together with George Martin, and he goes into the studio to record what turns out to be Tug of War. And as most Paul fans know, he brings Denny Laine into those sessions. So they do the bulk of the recording, or at least a hell of a lot of it, in Montserrat. Is that the Caribbean or the Bahamas? I forget, but anyway, it's somewhere like that, Virgin Islands. I don't remember, but it's George Martin's studio in this very idyllic atmosphere. It's kind of on an island, and Denny's there. I mean, pretty much as far as I know, from start to finish on those sessions. And if you look at the credits of Tug of War, he's credited on many tracks. You know, the vast majority of the tracks. Interestingly, as far as I can tell, he's not credited with background vocals. He certainly doesn't sing any lead vocals, but not even background vocals, which is interesting to me because his harmonies, along with Linda's, are such a big part of Wings. Even on those songs he wasn't personally singing or he didn't write, he's still quite often doing wonderful background blending with Linda. That's not the case here. Instead, he's got, as we know, he's got Stevie Wonder on here in a couple of tracks. He's got Carl Perkins on a track. And he's got Eric Stewart doing some background vocals from 10cc also. Why are all these different musicians, including Stanley Clarke, Steve Gadd, on this album? Why is this not a Wings album? Well, Paul says George Martin advised him to kind of scrap the Wings concept, at least for this album. Just focus on doing a good solo album and bring in whoever you want for the parts of, whatever song we're working on. Like, we'll kind of like draft the all-star team for to be the perfect match for what you're looking for here. So, I mean, Denny could see what's happening. He's right there. So was he under the impression this would still be a Wings album of sorts? Linda is on background vocals, so that's there. Did he think this could be kind of like an extended Wings? I don't know. I mean, certainly on Back to the Egg, they do the Rockestra band with, John Bonham and Kenny Jones and Pete Townsend and David Gilmour, a lot of other people. So they had experimented with bringing other people in, at least for a couple of songs. This is pretty much every song. And Paul's playing a lot of instruments himself too. Also, of course, Ringo's on a track on here, Take It Away. So again, more Beatles nostalgia for Paul. Okay, so now this album takes a long time to record. They do a lot of it in Montserrat, but then they come back to Abbey Road, and they're still working on it. In fact, they're together on the day John was very tragically murdered in New York City. Paul and Denny are together working on a track in Abbey Road. But I think maybe the Montserrat sessions were after that, actually. So anyway, it gets to be about 1981, or somewhere in there in 1981, and as I understand it, they're still doing tracking at Abbey Road, and what I think happens is that there's a session booked, and Paul is expecting Denny to be there, but Denny doesn't want to show up. Now, I'm getting this from this book here, Blackbird by Geoffrey Giuliano. He comes under some criticism by a lot of people for, like where's his sources for some things. But in the back of this book, he has a transcript interview with Denny Laine, and I believe Denny's wife at the time, JoJo, also. So I see no reason to doubt that. And JoJo at least says straight out that that's what happened, that Paul called their place at some point and said, can I talk to Denny? And Denny basically didn't want to get on the phone. And he said, or he told his wife, I'm not available. And his wife said, Denny's not going to be coming today. Paul was not pleased with that at all. He doesn't like to be told no, in any regard. And that basically was the end of their working relationship. So I see no reason to doubt the specifics of that. Now, why? But the question we keep asking in this whole video is about is why does that happen? Well, I think as we've documented here, it's just a case of rippling of resentments that they just kind of build up. I think through the Montserrat sessions, through the tug of war sessions, that is, I'm sure they had some camaraderie, but Denny is sidelined a little bit more here than he has been on Wings projects. George Martin's just pretty much solely focused on Paul. And there's also a story that I've heard, and where this is documented, I don't remember, but somebody had said that when they were doing the song Someone Who Cares from this album Tug of War, that Denny gave some critique to Paul, I think, on the lyrics, and Paul wasn't too happy to receive that from Denny. So you got that going on, and I think it's ultimately one of those things where you had these friends, or at least strong associates. I think they must have been friends, more or less, but they certainly had a fairly strong working relationship. They had some loyalty together. Paul had enough loyalty, even with George Martin wanting him to do a solo album, to say, look, I'm bringing Denny into this thing. He's my partner. He's going to stay involved. Denny had enough loyalty to say, yeah, maybe this won't be Wings, but I'm still going to help my friend Paul. And he's probably thinking, I want to keep that partnership going. That's good for my career. But at the same time, Paul wasn't going to tour again. Certainly after John was murdered, the security got a lot tighter. He's got a young family. He doesn't want to tour. Denny wants to tour. That's a whole big thing also, that he loves touring. He just enjoys that life of being on the road, and it's a good payday. Unfortunately, when he tried to go on tour himself, it wasn't as easy to sell tickets under the name Denny Laine as it is Paul McCartney, to say the least. So I think he was disappointed at what happened there for himself with his Denny Laine band. He did bring Steve Hawley into that band from Wings, and he probably had some high hopes there, but it never really got much, good traction anywhere, including England. He did end up putting out a bunch of other solo albums, none of which really broke through in any commercial way. But, I'm a big Denny Laine fan. I love his voice. I enjoy his guitar playing. There's an album he came out with called Master Suite, which is just him on guitar, which is really nice instrumental, kind of chill album. Love it. So I think he's very talented. As I said, I think as a singer he's great. I think he blended very well with Paul and Linda, and I just think he was a wonderful companion in Wings. Yes, was he at the level of partnership of somebody, I won't even say John Lennon, but just somebody who could really shine, at least, near the level of Paul? No, he wasn't. He was more the kind of partner that's going to be supportive. It's going to be happy a little bit in the background. And that was the story of Wings. And certainly Linda was okay with that. It's her husband. And Denny got okay with that. And he could kind of ride along with that. And it worked for 10 years. But as I say, as with other relationships, romance and in business, resentments can build up. Even through lots of success, you can still have resentments that build up. And I think at some point Denny, that is, got tired of the dynamic that was there. He didn't see that much of the future he wanted in terms of being in a rock band that's going to tour. Paul's music was more poppy in the 80s than it had been in the 70s. So that wasn't really Denny's strength so much. He's more of a R&B guy. He could be folky too, but just like pure pop is not really his thing. So he could kind of see the writing on the wall of where Paul was going, and it just didn't fit his vision. So ultimately, he went off on his own, as I say, with not too great success. But I think through it all, he was able to maintain a career as a musician. I don't believe he ever got, a 9-to-5 job, so to speak, or anything like that. So anybody who can do that, I give a lot of credit to, and he may not have had huge commercial success, but he probably had a lot of artistic success. Do I sometimes wish for his sake that he would have stuck it out a little bit more? Yeah, I think he is on Pipes of Peace, because the follow-up to Tug of War, because that was somewhat, some of Pipes of Peace was recorded at the time of Tug of War. But I think if he wouldn't have busted the working relationship, he could have stayed on for the Pipes of Peace recordings with Michael Jackson and so forth. I think he could have been involved in Broad Street. Now, I think even despite himself, if he would have been all in up through Broad Street, it probably would have come to an end there, because I think by that time, that was a real huge blow for Paul in terms of his reputation, and he probably would have wanted to move on in a new direction and find a new partner, and that turned out to be Eric Stewart for the Press to Play album, and eventually Elvis Costello for Flowers in the Dirt, and the rest is history, as they say. So it probably ended with Paul and Denny a few years earlier than it absolutely needed to, but that's just the course of history as it went, and we can use our imaginations and imagine how they might have worked together for a couple more albums. But there you go. That's my take on why Paul and Denny, their partnership came to an end in April of 1981. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please give us a like if you made it this far. Please subscribe to the channel if you're not so far as of yet. And as I said earlier on in the video, love to hear any comments you have, and especially if you have information that I may have missed. All right, take care till next time.